Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 12. Anne and Henrietta, finding themselves the earliest of the party the next morning, agreed to stroll down to the sea before breakfast. They went to the sands to watch the flowing of the tide, which fine south-easterly breeze was bringing in with all the grandeur which so flat a shore admitted. They praised the morning, gloried to the sea, sympathized in the delight of the fresh-feeling breeze. They were silent till Henrietta suddenly began with, "Oh, yes, I'm quite convinced that, with a few very exceptions, the sea air always does good, and there can be no doubt of it having been the greatest service to Dr. Shirley. After his illness last spring 12 months, he declared himself coming to Lyme for a month did him more good than all the medicine he took, and being by the sea only makes feel him young again. And now I cannot help but thinking it a pity that he does not live entirely by the sea. I do think he had better leave Uppercross entirely and fix at Lyme. Not do not you, Anne? To feel that agree with me that the best thing he could do, both for him and Mrs. Shirley? She has cousins here, you know, and many acquaintance, and it would be cheerful for her, and I am sure that you would be glad to get a place where she could have medical attendance at hand, in this case of having another seizure. I think it would be quite melancholy to have such an excellent people as Dr. and Mrs. Shirley to having been doing good all their lives, wearing out their last days in a place like Uppercross, where, excepting our family, seemed to shut out from all the world. I wish his friends would propose to him. I really think they ought, and to procuring a dispensation there'd be no difficulty at the time of his life. And, my doubt over scrupulous, do not think that a mistaken point of conscience, while a clergyman sacrifices his health for the sake of duties which might be well performed as another person, and at Lyme too, only 17 miles off. He'd be near enough if people thought there would be anything to complain of. Anne smiled more than once to herself during this speech, and entered into the subject, as ready to do good by entering into the feelings of a young lady as of a young man, though here it was a good of a lower standards for what she could be offered but a general acquaintance. She said all was reasonable and proper on the business, and felt claims to Dr. Shirley to repose as she ought. She saw how very desirable that it was that he should have some active, respectable young man as an curate, and was courteous enough to hint at the advantage of such resident curates of being married. "I wish," said Henrietta, very well pleased with her companions, "I wish that Lady Russell lived at Uppercross and were intimate with Dr. Shirley. I've always heard of Lady Russell as a woman of greatest influence with everybody. I always look upon her as to be able to sway a person to anything. I'm afraid of her, as I have told you before, quite afraid of her, because she is so very clever. But I respect her amazingly, and wish we had such a neighbour at Uppercross." Anne was amused at Henrietta's manner of being grateful, and also amused at the course of events of interest of Henrietta's views should have been placed at her friend in all favour with any of the Mungrose family. She had only time, however, for a general answer, and wished to be with another woman who were at Uppercross, before all subjects were suddenly ceased on seeing Louisa and Captain Wentworth coming towards them. They also came for a stroll till breakfast was likely to be ready. But Louisa, recollecting immediately afterwards that she had something to procure at the shop, invited them all to go back with her at the town, and they were all at her disposal. When they came to the steps leading upwards from the beach, a gentleman of the same moment preparing to come down, politely drew back, and stopped to give them way. And they ascended and passed him. As they were passed, Anne's face caught his eye, and looked at her with a degree of earnest admiration, which she could not be insensible of. He was looking remarkably well, and her very regular, very pretty features of having the blossom and freshness of youth restored by the fine wind which had been blowing on her complexion, though by the animation of the eye which also had produced. It was very evident that the gentleman, a completely gentlemanly manner, admired her exceedingly. Captain Wentworth looked her round at the instant the way which she shewed his noticing of it. He gave her a momentary glance, and the glance of brightness which seemed to say, "This man is struck with you, and even I, at this moment, see something like Anne Elliot again." After seeing Louisa run through her business, and loitering a little longer, they returned to the inn, and Anne, in passing afterwards, quickly from her own chamber into the dining room, had nearly run against the same very gentleman, and he came out of an adjoining apartment, before he conjured him to be a stranger like themselves, and determined that a well-looking groom, who was strolling at near the two inns as they came back, and should be his servant. Both the master and the man began in mourning assisted the idea, and it was now proved that he belonged to the same inn as themselves. In this second meeting, short as it was, to approve again of the gentleman's looks, but he thought of her as very lovely, and by the readiness of that propriety of apologies, he was a man of exceedingly good manners. He seemed about 30, and not about handsome, yet agreeable person, and Anne felt to know who he was. But they had nearly done breakfast, which the sound of a carriage, almost the first that they had heard since entering Lyme, drew half a party to the window. It was a gentleman's carriage, a curricle, but only coming round the stable yard at the front door. Somebody must be going away. It was driven by a servant in the morning. A word curricle made by Charles Mungrove jumped up that he might compare it to his own, and the children mourning roused Anne's curiosity, and the whole six were collected to look, and by the time the owner of the curricle was seen to be ensuing from the door amiss with bows and civilities of the house, taking a seat to drive off. "Ah!" cried Captain Wentworth instantly, and with a half glance at Anne, "it is the very man we passed." And Miss Mongrose agreed to it, having all kindly watched him at the far up hill they could, and returned to the breakfast table. The waiter came into the room soon afterwards. "Pray," said Captain Wentworth immediately, "can you tell us the name of that gentleman who has just gone away?" "Yes, sir, a Mr. Elliot, a gentleman of a large fortune, came in last night from Sidmouth. Dare say you heard the carriage, sir, while you were at dinner, going on for now at Crewick, to the way from Bath to London." "Elliot!" Many of them looked on each other, had repeated the name. Before this had gone through even the smart rapidity of a waiter. "Bless me!" cried Mary, must be our cousin. It must be Mr. Elliot. It must be indeed. Charles, Anne, it must it not be? In the morning, you see, our Elliot must be. How very extraordinary! It is in the same inn with us. And, but it must not be our Mr. Elliot, my father's next heir? Pray, sir," turning to the waiter, did you not his servant say whether he belonged to the Kellett family?" "No, ma'am, he did not mention no particular family. He said his master was a very rich gentleman, and be a baronite some day." "There, you see!" cried Mary in ecstasy, "just as I said, heir to Sir Walter Elliot. It was sure that would come out, and if so, depended upon it, and it was the circumstance which his servants are take pleasure to publish wherever he goes. But Anne, only conceive how extraordinary! I wish I only looked him once more. I wish we had been aware at the time who it was, that he might be introduced to us. What a pity that he should not be introduced to each other. Do you think he had the same Elliot countenance? I hardly looked at him, and I was looking at the horses, but I think he had something of the Elliot countenance. I wondered if the arms did not strike me. Oh, the great coat was hanging from over the panel, and hid his arms, so it did. Otherwise, I am sure I would have observed him in the library too. If the servant had not been in the morning, one should have known him by the livery. Putting all these very extraordinary circumstances together, said Captain Wentworth, we must consider the arrangement of the province that introduced her cousin. When she could command Anne's attention, Anne quietly tried to convince her that her father and Mr. Elliot had not, for many years, been on such terms to make the power of attempting an introduction at all desirable. And at the same time, however, it was a secret gratification to herself of seeing her cousin to know that the future owner of Kellynch was undoubtedly a gentleman, and had an air of good sense. She would not, upon any account, mention her to have met him the second time, and luckily Mary did not intend to have passed close to him in their earlier walk, and she would have felt quite ill-used by Anne actually having run against him in the passage, received his very polite excuses, and she would never been near him at all, and no, the cousinly interview must remain a perfect secret. "Of course," said Mary, "he would mention our seeing Mr. Elliot, and by the time you write to Bath, I think my father certainly ought to hear of it, but do mention all about him." And avoid a direct reply, but it would seem circumstance that she did not seem merely unnecessary to be communicated, and what ought to be suppressed, the offence of which given her father many years back. He knew Elizabeth's particular share if she suspended, and the Mr. Elliot's idea always produced irritation in both was beyond doubt. Mary never wrote to Bath herself, and all the toil of keeping the slow and unsatisfactory correspondence with Elizabeth fell on Anne. Breakfast had not been long over while they were joined by Captain and Miss Harville and Captain Benwick, whom they had been appointed to take their last walk about Lyme. Ought to be setting off for Uppercross by 1, and in the meanwhile all were together out of the doors as long as they could. And Anne found Captain Wentworth getting near her, and soon they were all fairly in the streets. Their conversation preceding the evening did not disincline him to seek her again. They walked for some time, in talking before of Mr. Scott and Lord Byron, and still as unable as before, and unable as any two readers, to think exactly alike of the merits of either, till something occasioned the most general change amongst their party. Instead of Captain Benwick, she had Captain Harville by her side. "Miss Elliot," he said, speaking rather low, "you have done a good deed in making that poor fellow talk so much. I wish you had such a company oftener. It is bad for him, I know, to be shut up as he is. What can we do? We cannot part." "No," said Anne. I can easily believe to be impossible, but in times, perhaps we know what time does to every case of affliction. You must remember, Captain Harville, that your friend may be called a young Moor. Only last summer, I understand. True enough," with a deep sigh. "Only June. And not known to him, perhaps, so soon. Not till the first week of August, when he came from the Cape, and made it into the Grappler. I was at Plymouth, dreading to hear of him. He sent letters, but the Grappler was under orders from Portsmouth. There must be used to follow him. But who was to tell it? Not I. I would soon have been run up from the yard's arm. Nobody could do it, but that good fellow," pointing to Captain Wentworth. "The Laconia had come into Plymouth the week before. No danger of her being sent to sea again. He stood his chance against the rest, and rode up for the leave of the absence, and without the rating of return, he travelled night and day till he got to Portsmouth, and rode off to the Grappler that instant, and never left the poor fellow for a week. That's what he did, and nobody else could have saved poor James. You may think, Miss Elliot, we're here is dear to us." Anne did think on the question the perfect decision, as much as in a reply of her own feeling could accomplish, or seemed unable to bear, for he was too much affected to renew the subject. When he spoke again, it was of something totally different. Miss Harville, given it as her opinion that her husband was quite walking enough by the time he reached home, determined the direction of all the party in which was to be their last walk. They would accompany them to their door, and then return and set them off themselves, and by their calculations there was just time for this. But as they drew near Cobb, there was such a general wish to walk along it once more, all were so inclined, and Louisa soon grew so determined that the difference of a quarter of an hour, it was found, it would be no difference of all, and with a kind leave-taking, there was a kind of interchange between the invitations and promises which may be imagined. They parted from the Captain and Miss Harville's at their own door, and still accompanied by Captain Benwick, who seemed to cling to them to the last, proceeded to make the proper adieu to the Cobb. Anne found Captain Benwick drawing near her, and Lord Byron's dark blue sea could not fail, and to their present view she gave him as much attention as possible. It was soon drawn. There was too much wind to make the high part of the new Cobb pleasant for the ladies, and they agreed to get down from the steps, and lower, and they were all contented to pass quietly and carefully down the steep flight, excepting for Louisa. She must jump down from them by Captain Wentworth. In all their walks she had to jump her from the stiles, and sensation was delightful to her. The hardness of the pavement for her feet made him less willing upon the present occasion. He did it, however, she was safely down, and instantly, to show her enjoyment, ran up the steps, and up and jumped down again. He advised her against it, though the jar too great, but no, he had reason to talk in vain. she smiled and said, "I am determined I will." And he put out his hands. She would too precipitate by half a second, and she fell on the pavement to the lower cobs, and was taken up lifeless. There was no wounds, no blood, no visible bruise, but her eyes were closed. She breathed not, her face was like dust. The horror of the moment to all who stood around. Captain Wentworth, who had caught her up, knelt with her in her arms, and, looking on, her face as pallid as her own in the agony of silence. "She is dead! She is dead!" screamed Mary, catching hold of her husband, and contributing with her his own horror, and looking on her face as pale as her own. "Is there no one to help me?" were the first words of Captain Wentworth, in a tone of despair, as there was all her strength was gone. "Go to him, go to him!" cried Anne. "For heaven's sake, go to him! And I can support her myself. Leave me, go to him. Rub her hands, rub her temples. Here are the salts. Take them, take them." Captain Benwick obeyed, and Charles, at the same moment, disengaging himself from his wife, both were with him, and Louisa was raised up and more firmly between them. Everything was done that Anne had prompted, but in vain. While Captain Wentworth, staggering against the walls for support, exclaimed in bitterest agony, "O God, her father and mother! A surgeon!" said Anne. He caught up the word and seemed to ruse him, saying only, "True, true, a surgeon this instant," was darting away. And Edith suggested Captain Benwick. "And it would not be better for Captain Benwick. He knows where the surgeon is to be found." Everyone was capable of thinking for the advantage of the idea, and in a moment, it was all done in rapid movements, Captain Benwick had resigned the poor corpse-like figure entirely to the brothers' care, and off town was the utmost rapidity. To the wrenched party left behind, it could be scarcely said of which the three, who were completely rational and suffering most, Captain Wentworth, Anne, or Charles, who were a really affectionate brother, hung over Louisa with sobs of grief, and could only turn his eyes to one sister to see the other in a state as insensible, or to witness the hysterical agitations of his wife, or calling on him to help which he could not give. Anne attending with all the strength and zeal and thought which the instinct supplied to Henrietta, and still tried, in the intervals, to suggest comfort to the others, tried to quiet Mary, to animate Charles, and to assuage the feelings of Captain Wentworth. Both seemed to look to her for directions. "Anne, Anne!" cried Charles, "what is to be done next? What, in the heavens' names, is supposed to be done next?" Captain Wentworth's eyes were also turned towards her. Had she not better carried to the inn? Yes, I am sure. Carry her gently to the inn. Yes, yes, to the inn, repeated Captain Wentworth, comparatively collected, and eager to be doing something. I will carry her myself. Mungrove, take care of the others. And by the time the report of the accident had been spread among the workmen and boatmen about the cove, many were collected near them, and to be useful if wanted, at any rate to enjoy the sight of the De- dead young lady. Nay, two dead young ladies, and for it proved quite as fine as the first report. To some of the best looking of these good people, Henrietta was consigned, for, partially revived, she was quite helpless, and for this manner, Anne walking by her side, and Charles attending to his wife, they set forward, treading back with feelings unutterable, in the ground which was so very lately, so light of heart, they had passed along, and they were not of Cobb. And before the Hartfields met them, Captain Benwick had been flying to their house with a countenance that showed something to be wrong, and had set off immediately, informed and directed as they passed, and towards the spot, shocked as Captain Hartfield was, and he brought to the senses and nerves that could be instantly useful, and not a look between him and his wife was decided what to be done. You must be taken to their houses, all must go to their house, and await for the surgeon's arrival. There will not be scruples, he was obeyed, and there was beneath his roof, while Louisa, in Miss Harville's directions, was conveyed up the stairs, and given possession of her own bed. Assistants, cordials, restoratives, and were supplied by her husband who needed them. Louisa, who had been opened her eyes, soon closed them again, without apparent consciousness. This had been proof of life, however, to the service of her sister, and Henrietta, though perfectly incapable of being in the same room with Louisa, was kept, by the agitation of hope and fear, from a return of her own insensibility. Mary, too, was growing calmer. The surgeon was with them almost before it had seemed possible. They were sick with horror while he examined, but he was not hopeless. The head had been a severe had been a severe concussion, and had been seen greater injuries recover from. He was by no means hopeless. He spoke cheerfully. Did not regard it as a desperate case. He did not say a few hours must end it. It was at first held, but beyond the hope of most, the ecstasy of such a reprieve, the rejoicing deep and silent, and fervent ejaculations of gratitude to heaven had been offered, may be conceived. The look, the tone of which, thank God, was uttered by Captain Wentworth, Ian was sure could be never forgotten by her, nor the sight of him afterwards, and as she sat near the table, leaning over it with folded arms and face concealed, as if overpowered with various feelings of his soul, trying the prayer and reflection to calm them. Louisa's limbs had escaped. There was no injury but to the head. It now became necessary for the party to consider what was best to be done. As for their general situation, which they were now able to speak, and which each other consult, that Louisa must remain where she was, however distressing to their friends to be involved with the Harvilles in such trouble, did not admit a doubt. Her removal was impossible, and the Harvilles silenced all scruples as much as they could. All gratitude was looked forward and arranged everything before the others began to reflect. Captain Benwick must have given up his room to them, and get another bed elsewhere. The whole was settled. There was only concern that the house was only accommodate no more. Yet perhaps, by putting the children away in the maid's room, or swinging a cot somewhere, they could hardly bear to think of not finding a room of two or three besides. They might be wished to say, though, with a regard to any attendance on Miss Mungrove, there need not be the least uneasiness in leaving her to Miss Harville's care entirely. Miss Harville was a very experienced nurse, and her nursery maid, who had lived with her long, and gone about her with everywhere, was just such another. Between these two, she could want no possible attendance by day or by night, and this was said with the truth, sincerity of feeling irresistible. Charles and Henrietta and Captain Wentworth were the three in consultation. For a little while it was only interchanged for the perplexity and terror. Uppercross, the necessity of some one going to Uppercross, the news to be conveyed was to be broken to Mr. and Mrs. Mungrove, and for the lateness of the morning, an hour already gone as they ought to have been off, the possibility of being in terrible time, and they would be first capable of nothing more than on purpose of such exclamations. But a while, Captain Wentworth, exciting himself, said, "We must be decided without the loss of another minute. Every minute is valuable. Someone must resolve for being off at Uppercross instantly. Mungroves, either you or I must go." Charles agreed, so he declared his resolutions of not going away, and he had a little encumbrance of being possible to Captain and Miss Harville, but after leaving his sister in such a state, he neither ought nor would. It was far to be decided. It was Henrietta at first who declared the same, and she, however, was soon persuaded to think differently. The usefulness of her staying! She, who had not been able to remain in Louisa's room, or to look at her, without the sufferings made her worse than helpless. She was forced to acknowledge that she could do no good, yet was still unwilling to be away. Touched by the thought of her mother and father, she gave it up, she consented, she was anxious to be at home. The plan had been reached to this point, when Anne, coming quietly down from Louisa's room, could not bear could not but hear what followed, for the parlour door was opened. "Then it is settled, Mungrove," cried Captain Wentworth, "that you stay, and I shall take care of your sister home. But as to rest, as to the others, if one stays to assist Miss Harville, I think it need be only one. Miss Charles Mungrove will, of course, wish to get back to her children, but if Anne will stay, no one is so proper, so capable as Anne." She paused a moment to recover from the emotion of hearing so spoken of. The two warmly agreed of what he said. Then she appeared. "You will stay, I am sure. She will stay and nurse her," he cried, turning to her speaking with a glow, yet a gentleness that seemed to almost restoring the past. She coloured deeply, and he recollected himself and moved away. She expressed herself most willing and happy to remain. It was what she had been thinking of, what to be allowed to do, and on the bed of the floor in Louisa's room would be sufficient enough for her, if Mrs. Harfield would think but so. One more thing, and all seemed arranged, was it was rather desirable that Mr. and Mrs. Mungrove should be previously alarmed of some shared delay, and required time at Uppercross horses to send them back. It'd be a dreadful extension of suspense, and Captain Wentworth proposed, and Charles Mungrove agreed. It would be much better for him to take the chaise of the inn, and leave Mr. Mungrove's carriage and horses to be sent home the next morning early, when there was only a further advantage of sending an account of Louisa's night. And Captain Wentworth now hurried off to get everything on his part, and to be soon followed by the two ladies. When the plan was made known to Mary, however, there was an end of it. She was so wretched and so vehement, complained so much of injustice being a go away instead of Anne, who was nothing to Louisa, as to her as a sister, and had the best right to stay in on Rita's steed. Why was she not to be as useful as Anne, and to go home without Charles, too, without her husband? No, it was too unkind. In short, she said more than her husband could long withstand, and none of the others could oppose when he gave away. There could be no help for it. The change of Mary for Anne was inevitable, and Anne had never submitted more reluctantly to the jealous and ill-judging claims of Mary. But so it must be, and they set off for the town. Charles taking care of his sister, and Captain Benwick attending to her, she gave a moment's recollection, and they hurried along as to the little circumstances with the same spots witnessed earlier in the morning. There she had been listened the schemes for Dr. Shirley leaving Uppercross. Farther on, she had first seen Mr. Elliot. At the moment it seemed all that now could be given to any one but Louisa, for those who were wrapped up in her welfare. Captain Benwick was most considerably attentive to her, and united, as all seemed, the distress of the day. She felt an increasing degree of good will towards him, and a pleasure to even think that it might, perhaps, be the occasion of continuing her acquaintance. Captain Wentworth was on the watch for them in the chaise of the four in waiting, and stationed in their conveyances in the lowest part of the street. But his evident surprise, vexation at the substitution of one sister for the other, the change of countenance and astonishment for the expressions begun and suppressed, while with Charles was listened to, and made but a mortifying reception of Anne, or must at least convince her that she was valued as only as she could be useful to Louisa. She endeavoured to be composed, and to be just, without emulating the feelings of an Emma towards her Henry. She would be attended on Louisa with a zeal above the common claims of regard, for his sake, and she hoped he would not be long so unjust as to suppose she would shrink unnecessarily from the office of a friend. It was meanwhile she was in the carriage that he handed them both in, and placed himself between them. In this manner, under these circumstances, full of astonishment and emotion to Anne, she quitted Lyme. How the long stage would pass, and, to the effect of manners, would be sort of intercourse, she could not foresee. It was all natural, however. He was devoted to Henrietta, and turning towards her, when he spoke at all, with the view of supporting her hopes and raising her spirits. In general, his voice and manner was studiously calm. To spare Henrietta from agitation seemed the governing principle. Once only, when she had been grieving over the last ill-judged, ill-fated walk to the Cobb, and the bitterly lamenting that it ever had been thought of, he burst forth, as if wholly overcome. "Don't talk of it! Don't talk of it! Oh God, that I had not given away to her at that fatal moment! I had done as I ought, but to so eager and so resolute, dear sweet Louisa!" Anne wondered if it ever occurred to him of the question of justness in his own previous opinion, to the universal facility of the advantage of firmness of character, and whether it might not strike him that, like all other qualities of mind, it should have its proportions and limits. She thought it might scarcely escape him to feel that a persuadable temper might sometimes be in favour of happiness as a very resolute character. They got on fast, and was astonished to recognize the same hill as the same object so soon. Their actual speed, heightened by some dread of the conclusion, and made the road appear but as half as long as the day on before. It was growing quite dusk, however, by the time they were in the neighborhood of Uppercross that there had been total silence among them for some time. When Rita had been leaning in the back corner with a shawl over her face and giving the hope of her having cried herself to her sleep. When they were going up their last hill, Anne found herself at all once addressed by Captain Wentworth in a low, cautious voice. He said, "I've been considering what we must best do. She must not appear at first. She could not stand it. I've been thinking whether you had not better remain in the carriage with her, while I go in to break it to Mr. and Mrs. Mungrove. Do you think that is a good plan?" She did. He was satisfied, and they said no more. The remembrance of the appeal remained to a pleasure of her, and a proof of friendship, in deference to her judgment. A pleasure, and when it came to sorting a parting proof, its value did not lessen, and when the distressing communication at Uppercross was over, and he had seen the father and mother quite as composed as could be hoped, the daughter all the better for the being with them, he announced his intentions of returning in the same carriage to Lyme, and when the horses were baited, he was off.